Hello and welcome to What We Leave We Carry. I'm Colin Grant. We're at the start of a new podcast series for WritersMosaic, telling true life stories of migrants who have come to the UK over land, sea and air to make new lives. Each episode will be a true story told in the words and the voices of the people themselves. It's a huge task, and to help me I'm joined by a group of writers, many who also have migrant stories. We're going to be going round the country and we'll sit, listen to and record stories that are brave, funny and always moving. Okay then, let's kick off with my introduction to the series, which I hope will surprise and delight you. What we leave, we carry. My parents, Ethling and Bagai, left Jamaica in 1959, but they carried Jamaica with them when they came here. That notion inspired this project, What We Leave, We Carry. What you leave behind when you migrate, and what you carry with you physically and emotionally. Ethling and Bagai carried an ambivalence towards Britain with them, which was often compounded by the hostility they met here. That hostility expressed itself most nakedly in 1968, after Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech, in which the bilious politician predicted an outbreak of racial war if immigration was not checked. Though Powell was censured by his Conservative Party, even as a child, I understood that the sentiments he expressed, that we black people were getting the whip hand over the white population and should be put in our place and ideally encouraged or forced to go back home, were widely held by white people. I never want to revisit the bigotry of Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood Britain, but often I'm reminded that vestiges of it still remain. A few years ago, I went to a garage on the outskirts of Romford in East London on a quest to buy a second-hand car. The car dealer was not as smooth and charming as I had expected. He looked wary and battle-hardened. But when I asked him if he'd let me go for a test drive on my own, he didn't hesitate, handing over the keys to me straight away. The casualness with which he did so suggested he'd come to the conclusion there was no need to worry that I might abscond because there was a subtle but familiar signal, a tell, he had detected that marked me as a safe bet. "I can see you're proper people," he said. I was quietly delighted. I bought the car. It turned out to be a dud, but never mind. Reflecting on this encounter later that evening, I began to worry that I'd been charmed by his inclusion of me in his tribe of proper people. Why hadn't I realised that in using that description, the car dealer was drawing a distinction between me, the son of West Indian migrants, who was proper, not too far removed culturally from the local white population, and someone who might have been descended from South Asian migrants who was not proper, an unfavoured alien to whom he would not have given the keys for a solo test drive. Romford had felt familiar. It reminded me of the stultifying ordinariness of Luton, where I grew up, a town whose modest immigrant population was drawn from the Irish, West Indian and Pakistani communities. In the 1970s, we lived among the Irish on a council estate called Farley Hill, and were more familiar with our Irish neighbours than the Pakistanis who lived on other estates and downtown. We sometimes visited Bury Park, the predominantly South Asian part of Luton, but only to buy cheap fruit and vegetables. If there was a balkanisation of the population back then, it never felt ideological about race, religion or culture. Recently though, when I returned to Luton, silos of separation appear to have emerged in the intervening years. In my youth, Luton had been more than 90% white. Now it was majority non-white, and walking through Bury Park, I did not see any black or white people. It seemed entirely South Asian. I asked Sister Vaughan, an elderly West Indian acquaintance, what Bury Park was like these days. "Oh, me not go down them part anymore," she answered. I asked her why not. She kissed her teeth. "Me don't have no passport we go down there." I was shocked by her bigotry and chose to focus on the humour with which she spoke. When the laughter subsided, I was left alone with troubling thoughts. Doubts about my own bigotry crept up on me. I struggled to name any person of South Asian origin whom I had befriended in my youth. The desirability or even the possibility had never occurred to me. That violent and febrile time of my childhood might seem long past, but in some regards, this country is still at war with itself, at war with how it would like to be seen, heard and remembered. The self-inflicted wounds of the Brexit referendum have exposed divisions within British society, not just between the so-called host and migrants, but between migrant groups themselves. Antagonisms and prejudices that might have been disguised over the years since Powell's speech are now often laid bare and expressed without fear of censure. At times, the mood at large in the country resembles the toxic 1960s and 70s, when migrants and their families were viewed with great suspicion. At least that's how it feels. What can be done about that suspicion? In the 1950s, the psychologist Gordon Allport hypothesized that prejudice between groups could be lowered by contact with each other. Countries around the world gradually absorbed the lessons of what became known as contact theory. In Botswana, for instance, the government reduced tribal conflict by compelling officials from one particular tribe to relocate to areas dominated by another tribe. A version of contact theory was tried out by local government in Bradford in the 1960s, when children of South Asian migrants were bused from their homes to schools in neighbourhoods where the children were mostly white. It was a problematic experiment, and the policy was eventually scrapped when deemed discriminatory. But Sister Vaughan, who lacked a passport to Bury Park, might have benefited from more contact with her South Asian neighbours. There are many parts of Britain where people live cheek by jowl with neighbours whose lives are a mystery to them. What We Leave, We Carry is an oral history of migration to Britain, of overlooked and marginalised individuals. It's a chance to listen to Britain, to hear voices often drowned out by the shrill anti-immigrant rhetoric that has afforded too much space in our culture. It explores some of the richly rewarding stories which have changed how we see ourselves and complicated the very nature of what we consider British. In doing so, it illuminates the fallacy of the persistent myth of there being a distinction between true Brits and those other lot. The inspiring work of the Chicago radio broadcaster and oral historian Studs Terkel, along with the Belarusian Nobel laureate, journalist and oral historian Svetlana Aleevich, serve as models for this project, as they did for my previous oral history book, Homecoming, Voices of the Windrush Generation. What We Leave, We Carry is not a solo effort, however, but a project that also belongs to a team of WritersMosaic writers: Snezna Churchich, Chitra Ramaswamy, Amanda Villanova, Suzanne Harrington, John Siddiq, Maria Yavstrevska, Nikita Gulheni, Marjorie Lotfi, Isabel Dupuy, Ellie Dobbing, Clementine Burnley, and Amal Said. Their strong connections with migrancy, some with their own migrant tales from Serbia, Cameroon, Puerto Rico, Ireland, Haiti, India, Poland, Iran, and Somalia, bring an insider-outsider perspective to What We Leave, We Carry, and have been the starting point for this project. We have already begun journeying around the country, listening to people who have come to make a new life in the UK. Along the way, we will be exploring ideas around the meaning of migrancy that will be developed throughout our upcoming WritersMosaic podcast series, and later in an oral history book to be published in 2025. Our ambition is also to visit towns and villages that are not so readily associated with migration. We'll hear, for example, from Indians who originally came to Dundee as students in the 1950s to learn about the manufacture of jute, knowledge they were supposed to return with to India but remained unexpectedly in Dundee, and from Serbs in Bourneville, associated with the village ever since Dame Elizabeth Cadbury sponsored 13 Serbian refugee children following World War I. Elsewhere, the interviewees will range from South Korean restaurateurs in New Malden to Yemeni steelworkers in Sheffield, from the Polish coal miners of Doncaster to Ukrainian textile workers in Bradford, from Nigerian hairdressers in Peckham to Lithuanian tailors in Glasgow, and to many more. The practice and ethics of oral history have evolved over the years with the rigorous intervention of universities and culture centres such as the British Library and the Smithsonian Institution. While cognizant of academic protocols and conventions, the writers of What We Leave We Carry will lean into their own intuitions to create environments that allow for the unexpected and for the freedom and autonomy of unfettered conversation. The act of simply recording experiences doesn't fulfill the potential of oral histories. Historians don't write history, they curate it. The same is true for oral historians and the storytellers whose tales inform those histories. The source material, the remembrances, are malleable and ready to be shaped and curated in ways that reveal the inexplicable. Inevitably, there is artifice in editing, ordering, and arranging non-linear memories, but at the centre of What We Leave We Carry is an attempt to be faithful to the uniqueness of individuals, and our evolving methods will give space for a sensorial approach. What is the sound, smell, touch, sight, and taste of Britain? Sometimes people are alarmed when they hear themselves in the recordings or see transcripts of what they've said, revealing idiosyncrasies of speech or patterns of thought that appear amplified or exaggerated. But this way of seeing and expressing is what makes them special, and we will endeavour, with their blessing, to preserve their sense of themselves by accurately reflecting their spoken words. What We Leave We Carry will also honour people's style. Growing up in a West Indian household in Luton and observing my parents' peers, I became attuned to the importance of style. How people presented themselves and deployed their style was fascinating. The man could take away your job, your belly could be knocking on your backbone, but your style saved you. No one could take away your style. It was your character. Whilst exploring the impact of migrants on the fabric and culture of this country, we also pay attention to the work of social historians such as Haim Bamant. In his book, Point of Arrival, Bamant noted how in London's East End, the Samuels and the Cohens have given way to the Selims and the Khans. One gentleman's outfitter was now a travel agent and some sort of notary public. The Hebrew lettering on the fascias has given way to Bengali, though many of the mezuzah, the little scrolls in a metal casing which most Jews have on their doorposts, still persist. Long after the Jewish families had departed, the mezuzahs, emblems of the sanctity of home, remain, like cultural half-lives, as traces of their past. Why do some groups leave more lasting traces than others? Where, for instance, are the descendants of the 50,000 Huguenots who fled France in the 16th and 17th centuries? What happened to the thousands of Belgian refugees who arrived in Richmond and Twickenham during World War I and World War II? They disappeared en masse and with little trace by the 1950s. It's easier to trace the presence of black people, right? Not necessarily so. Cedric is an unremarkable-looking Englishman who sports a blazer and a tan that suggests a recent sunny holiday abroad. In recounting his genealogy, he tells you, Francis had a son called Isaac. Isaac had a son called Enoch. Enoch had a son called Edward. Edward had a son called Norman. And Norman had a son called Cedric. And that's me, Cedric Barber. Cedric's family tree goes back 250 years to Francis Barber, the loyal black manservant of Samuel Johnson. Frances Barber married Elizabeth Ball, a white English woman, in 1773, and 2.5 centuries later, their descendants were going around in disguise, their pale skin, like the Huguenots, giving them camouflage. Cedric concludes that with the passage of time and intermingling, we've turned white now. Cedric Barber exemplifies the assimilationist ideal of migration, but he also shows that the received wisdom of Britain's past homogeneity has always been a fiction. The impact of non-Indigenous people on British culture was undeniably limited in previous centuries by their small numbers relative to the host population. All that changed with mass migration, which began in the late 1940s with displaced Europeans after World War II, and the arrival of citizens of the Commonwealth, especially West Indians and South Asians. What we leave we carry will throw up commonalities and intersections between groups. In the 1960s and 70s, my mother befriended Irish women on the production line of Vauxhall Motors, and growing up in a Jamaican household on an estate brimming with families from Cork and Donegal, I never doubted the appropriateness of accepting a place on the football team of Luton Irish whenever they were down a player for the Sunday League. At a time when there is so much rupture over immigration in the UK and rancorous debates about those who constitute the kind of proper people identified by the Romford car dealer, this project hopes to give voice to the people themselves, to deepen and complicate the story about who belongs here and how they have enriched our society. But of course, migrants do not live in isolation from their British-born neighbours. What we leave we carry will also hear from those who consider themselves to be the original proper people, with a history and connection to the UK that they claim to be longer than others, and therefore feel more deserving of the privilege of citizenship, about their thoughts and interactions with the relative newcomers. In this way, the project also aims to be an empathic exploration of the nervous entitlement of so-called true Brits, struggling to hold on to a better version of the fabled past and mourning their own imagined futures. Britain has changed, not just with the introduction of new voices, languages and accents, but also with an evolving soundscape generated by a population renewed and re-energized by migration. I've long admired Humphrey Jennings and other pioneers of the early British documentary film movement. The preface to Jennings' 1940s short documentary Listen to Britain conjured the sound of a country at war. The evening hymn of the lark, the roar of the Spitfires, the dances in the great ballroom at Blackpool, the clank of machinery and shunting trains. These poetic and elegiac evocations are poignant, and watching the film is as experiential as the best oral history texts. The alchemy of oral history requires the patience and persistence of a subject and portraitist working over many sittings. Here, though, the storyteller is both portraitist and subject, and the revelatory feelings that emerge may previously have been hidden from them. Svetlana Aleevich writes, "Remembering is not a passionate or dispassionate retelling of reality that is no more, but a new birth of the past when time goes in reverse. It's like time travel," she believes. When you sit and listen to people, it's as if they're coming back from another planet. Working on what we leave we carry, we imagine that time will travel forwards and in reverse, and we welcome the astonishments that are bound to come.